Well, my daughters were very scared. This video, by the way, was a song written by my daughter, the twin daughters. The illustrations were done by my other daughter, and here the drawings they did as children. Tough to be the father or the child of a weapons inspector, and it scared them, and they were scared to death about the danger of nuclear war. So they created this artificial world that allowed them to escape, and this video captured that. And it's what motivates me to do what I do. Saving the lives of my children, saving the lives of your children, saving the lives of all the innocent people in America and around the world. The danger of a nuclear conflict today is greater than it has been at any time in our history. There are people who say, well, Scott, what about the Cuban Missile Crisis? The nuclear arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union in 1962 pale in comparison to the nuclear arsenals that exist today, both in destructive power, deliverability, etc. Simply put, back then we could destroy a continent or two. Today we destroy the entire world. But the thing that's missing is that back then we were talking to our adversaries. We were having conversations. Khrushchev was speaking to Kennedy, either directly or indirectly. Ambassadors were talking to one another. Today, there is no viable dialogue with the Russian Federation as we are lurching towards a nuclear conflict. This panel is designed to scare you, as I said. We have two distinguished fearmongers. Dr. Theodore Postol. He is a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is a weapons expert. He used to advise the director of naval operations, I believe, about strategic nuclear war planning. I have known him over the course of the last 3 decades. He first came to my radar when he said that American Patriot missiles weren't shooting down Iraqi Scud missiles. And of course, everybody said, "Pa, you're wrong." He was right. And today he's right about a lot of things. And he's going to talk to you about the dangers of nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, he's right again. Sir, scare him.
Well, I hope what I'll do is just simply tell you the truth. And I'm certain that if I do my job properly, you will be scared. So anybody who understands what I'm talking about will be scared. Do we have the slides being projected yet? I can't see behind me. Yes. Okay. Since our concern during this panel is the possibility of an escalation to an unwanted nuclear war with Russia, Scott and I and Larry agreed that we wanted to brief the audience first about the effects of a single nuclear detonation on Washington. It's on a scale that you can begin to comprehend. The problem with nuclear weapons effects is they're on such a large scale that it's very hard from human experience to conceptualize what's actually happening. What I'm going to focus on is the effects of a single 800 kiloton nuclear detonation over Washington. And why don't we put up actually slide 3, if you can. And a single Sarmat long-range missile, Russian long-range missile, or an SS-18 carries 10 of these missiles. So we're only talking about 1/10 of the payload of a single missile. The Russian military command has about 400 of these that can be launched within minutes of a command. So they're very quickly launchable. Incidentally, they have to be because they are under threat from American ballistic missiles, which would have a very high probability of destroying these missiles in their silos before they could be launched. The Russians are fully aware of this, and I do not know directly, but I can assure you from my own experience as a nuclear planner in the United States that they have taken what they judge to be the most appropriate measures to assure that these missiles can be launched on short warning if need be. And this is a danger in itself, that the launch times are highly compressed. The Russians can also launch about 1,600 100 kiloton bombs from land and submarine launched ballistic missiles. I can talk about those in a question and answer period, but they are very close to as damaging as the 800 kiloton warhead, because nuclear weapons effects scale slowly with yield. So let me focus first on the bomb of 800 kilotons, which is shown to you on the screen here. What you're seeing now is the fireball. Since the bomb is intentionally detonated at an altitude of about 1 mile over the city. It'll be clear shortly why the choice of 1 mile. Doesn't have to be that. It could be detonated at the ground or at another height of burst, but it's a reasonable guess. And when the detonation occurs, an enormous amount of energy is released in a few hundredths of millionths of seconds into a very small volume within the nuclear weapon itself. And because there's so much energy, the temperature goes up during the period of peak energy output to about 100 million degrees Kelvin. The center of the sun is about 20 million degrees Kelvin. So you can imagine how intense the environment is during this very short interval of output. The energy radiates from this tiny volume of space, mostly in the form of X-rays, very short wavelength light, electromagnetic energy. And the X-rays are absorbed by air. So because they're absorbed by air, they quickly go out at the speed of light, and they will heat a small volume of air, about 300 feet in diameter, to a temperature of about 1 million degrees. So we have cooled within a millionth of a second to a ball of just 1 million degrees, if that just 1 million means nothing to you. And this mass of air, which has not even moved at this point because it's happened so fast, begins to expand violently at about 1 million miles per hour. So it acts like a fast moving piston on the surrounding cooler air, compressing the air into a shock wave of enormous power and extent. So the fireball, when it reaches its maximum, which is shown here in this diagram, radiates about at a temperature of about 8,000 degrees Kelvin, and the surface of the sun is about 2,000 degrees Kelvin. So it's hotter than the surface of the sun. And in fact, this fireball is radiating light and heat at a rate probably 2.5 times, well, 2.5 times, determined by physics, 2.5 times the equivalent area of the fireball, the equivalent area of the surface of the sun that's covered by the fireball. So since the sun is 90 million miles away, and the fireball is only a few miles from the surface of the Earth, it can set fires at fantastic ranges. In this case, about 6 to 7 miles from the detonation point. And the fires, as I'll show you shortly, are what generate the enormous amount of damage. Most people are focused on the blast pressure. The blast is almost irrelevant. And if you take the fires into account, you would find that the number of prompt deaths from a nuclear explosion of this kind of yield will easily be 3 or 4 times larger than what the Joint Chiefs of Staff would tell you when they briefed you if you were the President of the United States. We do not include the effects of the fireball. We are focused on blast, which is minimal, almost non-existent relative to the fireball. In the diagram, you see a kind of smudging of the ground below. That's because the ground is going to explosively disintegrate due to the enormous amount of light and heat from the fireball. So for example, if you were underneath the detonation point, where of course the brightness of the fireball is going to be most extreme, literally surfaces like asphalt would explosively evaporate, causing shock waves of their own. I mean, that's how enormously intense the light and heat from the fireball would be. If we go to the next slide, we see that when the fireball reaches its maximum diameter, it's got about 1% the density of air inside it. And the pressure from this very hot air is roughly equal to the pressure of the air around it. So the compressed shock wave from the earlier rapidly expanding fireball expands as a shock wave. And in the next diagram, we see why the 1 mile altitude might be chosen. If we go to slide 5, what happens is the primary shock wave will reach the ground, and you'll get a secondary shock generated by reflection off the ground. And at the junction between the secondary and the primary shock, you get an adding of the overpressure from the two different shocks. Basically, in this case, a doubling of the overpressure. So you can extend the range at which the blast is most damaging. It's kind of an irrelevancy, I want to underscore, because the real effects of the fireball are it sets fires over vast range. Now, if we look at slide 6, I've just inserted a diagram of the expanding, well-known mushroom cloud. Everybody who's grown up under the nuclear threat knows this this phenomenon. And this is like 30 or 40 seconds after so it's a long time, half a minute, more than half a minute. The fireball will have risen to an altitude of maybe 2-3 miles. It'll be rising at about 100 miles per hour, 150 miles per hour. But what ultimately happens, is shown in the slide 7, is the fireball will continue to buoyantly rise until after maybe 10 or 12 minutes, it reaches the bottom of the stratosphere at about 12 miles altitude. And earlier in the process, it is sucking air behind it. So if you were on the ground at a range of maybe a couple of miles and lived through the initial shock, you wouldn't be living long after that, but somehow survived the initial shock, you would experience a blast wave, a more lower high pressure, but longer in extent, pushing in toward the detonation point. In other words, first the shock wave comes out, knocks things down, and then it starts sucking in, pulling things into the fireball direction, into the ground zero direction. In the next slide, I show you the area that would be set on fire. The reddish area, the yellow area is the area almost certainly that would be on fire, but the reddish areas absolutely, without doubt, would be on fire. And it's important to understand that the area on fire, the size of the area on fire, in addition to the amount of combustible material on the ground, determines the intensity of the fire storm that will be created by this mass fire. Just a very simple way of thinking of it. I'll choose the next slide, please. What happens is, if I have a pancake on fire, so there's a tremendous amount of energy per unit area being generated by just combustion, and nothing to do with the nuclear weapon except it's fire. But it's covering an area of maybe 150 square miles, because that's how much is on fire simultaneously. Now, if you just do a thought experiment and double the radius of this area, of this pancake that's on fire, the area that's combusting goes goes up by a factor of the square, 4, while the perimeter only goes up by a factor of the radius, by r. So you can see how the area on fire, the larger the area, the more intense the winds into the fire zone are going to be. And we know from experience, we have actual computer models we have now done, now that we have more modern technologies, that the air temperature in this fire zone will be well above the boiling point of water, and the wind speeds on the ground, so we're talking in the streets, will be hurricane force or more. So this is not, if you're worried about blast, this is the last thing you should be worried about. If we just look for a second at the only historical data we have, let's look at slide 10. This is a photograph from the sky of Nagasaki prior to the atomic bombing there. And the full width of the photograph is about a mile. It's a small area relative to the area that would be completely destroyed by the higher yield weapon, which would be 150 square miles, not a few square miles. But what I like, I don't like, what I find useful about this photograph is it's close enough to give you a feeling of, that this is a city. It's not so far away that everything is smudged out. The next photograph shows you what that area looked like after the attack. And this is kind of an understatement of what you would see if in the target area from this 800 kiloton warhead. And so I'll close with 2 images that will be shocking, but I'm not showing them to you just because I want to shock you. I want to tell you, explain to you why these weapons are different. So I'm emphasizing the fire. In the next slide, you see a man in the street. This is a man who died in the street in Hamburg from a much less intense hostile environment from a firestorm initiated in 1943 in a mass fire raid. It's just fire that did it. Large area was set on fire simultaneously. The wind speeds were well into hurricane force. The man understandably chose to try to run, and of course he just went out into the air. Clothes were burnt off him. He was overcome immediately. And there were lots of bodies found like this. And for those who made the devil's choice of staying in a shelter, you can see this, the next slide. The shelters became superheated, turned into ovens. In this particular case, carbon dioxide from partially burned upper sections of the buildings filtered in, but these people would have been roasted anyway. And this was the kind of bodies, which incidentally, they would disintegrate into ash once the shelters were opened up. Now, I'll end with one other comment, and that enormous cloud that I showed you earlier. 1 minute after that cloud has been formed by stabilized, well, it'll be a couple of minutes stabilizing, the radioactivity in that cloud is about 1 million times larger than the radioactivity released at Chernobyl at that particular moment, 1 minute. The radioactivity diminishes tremendously, very fast. So at 1 hour, it would be 5 or 10,000 times greater than what was released at Chernobyl. And one day, it'll still be 100 times greater. So those materials are going to be falling out of the cloud. That's a phenomenon called fallout. And that's going to create an additional hazard many, many miles, 50, 100 miles downwind, as well as in the target area as well. So this is just a very brief explanation of what could occur if a single weapon out of thousands were detonated over Washington. I'll stop here. Those of you who would like a slide deck which would be more comprehensive because I've selected, just a few slides for time limitations. Just write me a little note at Postol, P-O-S-T-O-L, at MIT.edu, and I'll be happy to send you a slide deck with all the latest and greatest pictures about what happens when a nuclear attack occurs. I'll need a couple of days to do it, because I'm still traveling, but feel free to just write me. I'll be happy to send it to you. Thanks.
I just want to, first of all, thank you very much for that. I don't feel very good, and you shouldn't either.